We know that Homo erectus preceded Homo sapiens. We know that Homo sapiens evolved from some population of Homo erectus. We know that this doesn't happen in one go. So, for example, a Homo erectus mama doesn't give birth to a Homo sapiens baby. Every baby is, by definition, the same species as its mama. But what do we know about the details? Well, we only have little windows into what actually happened. Little windows like these archaeological sites. Remember, by about 500,000 years ago, we have evidence that Homo erectus was geographically dispersed all across Africa and Eurasia. We see evidence of their culture. Their stone tools are all over the place. We then explored the last 1 million years in Europe, and I asked you to take a close look at the geography of Europe. Now, don't think about the countries as we know them today, but look at the land, as animals and hominids would have moved about on it. Where do land masses connect? Where could animals and people have easily traversed? Where are the dead-end streets? Now, with this perspective, you can see that Europe is a peninsula. We first started thinking about this in the last video, thinking about the ice sheets and where they would have been during the glacial maximums, during the ice ages. Well, the main crossroads are eastern and northeastern Africa, thinking about where people would have been going, where animals could have traversed. So, eastern and northeastern Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, the land between the Persian Gulf, the Caspian Sea, the Black Sea, and the Mediterranean. It is the land we now label as Ethiopia, Eritrea, Sudan, Egypt, Syria, Israel, Jordan, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Turkey, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Georgia. Europe was not a crossroads at all, but rather, it was an outpost, a peninsula, peninsular Europe. Now, the tyranny of the present makes it hard not to think of Europe as a central part of human evolution. And that perception is mostly just a reflection of who has written most of the scientific literature that has influenced our science over the last couple of 100 years. It's important to remember that the central part of our more recent evolutionary history has long been happening in East Asia, the Middle East, Africa. When it comes to peninsular Europe, we saw that Homo erectus was present 1 million years ago, but by the end, the hominids living there were Neanderthals. The fossils recovered at Cima de los Huesos from 400,000 years ago strongly indicate that the erectus population living on the peninsula gradually shifted from Homo erectus morphology to Neanderthal morphology, likely as an adaptation to the cold of the northern latitudes and to being isolated in peninsular Europe during the ice ages. Well, what about elsewhere in the world? What else was going on? Well, let's pick up the next part of this evolutionary story in Africa. 1 million years ago, there were members of Homo erectus, like the person to whom this head belonged. The size of the brain case, the shape of the brow ridges, this is Homo erectus, not Neanderthal, not Homo sapiens. About 500,000 years ago, also in Ethiopia, a day's walk from where the Daka specimen you just saw was found, lived this person. This skull was found at a site called Bodo, so we tend to refer to this specimen as the Bodo cranium. The face is large, the brow ridges strong, but not to the same extreme as Homo erectus, nor in the shape of the Neanderthals. Another feature that might not immediately jump out at you is the size of the brain case. Bodo had a cranial capacity like Homo sapiens. This fossil was my favorite example of something that's transitional. So Bodo isn't Homo erectus. Bodo isn't Homo sapiens. Bodo is most definitely not Neanderthal. Well, what is he or she? Well, here's my question for you. Does it matter? Does it really matter what species label we stick on this skull? No Linnaean name is going to change the fact that this is something right in between, that evolution is entirely made up of transitional fossils. We only have names carefully attached to specimens that are clearly different from other specimens because we haven't yet found the fossils that show the shifting populations between them. And then, at 160,000 years ago, you have this man. And a man he was. You can use the shape of the skull to interpret the sex of the individual, using all the criteria that forensic osteologists use today, because this guy, he's Homo sapiens. But he didn't have any of the variants that we use to infer geographic ancestry today. This skull from a place called Herto in Ethiopia. This person predates that geographic differentiation. Here's an artist's reconstruction of this dashing man. There were actually 2 adult skulls found. One was very fragmentary, and the other was more complete. The more complete one belonged to him. In addition to the 2 adults, there was also the skull of a child. A child, pictured here, whose cranial development indicated that they were between 6 and 7 years old when they died. This skull is particularly intriguing for another reason, too. As the bones of the skull, they show evidence of polish. A polish it's a very worn, smooth surface that only forms from when bone is handled repeatedly. This skull appears to have been carried around, passed from person to person. There's kind of no other way that we know of to get this type of polish on bone. But why? Was this part of a mortuary practice? Who was this child? Someone very special? Did they have religion? Is this why they handled the skull for so long before it came to rest on the edge of the lake in eastern Africa? Who knows? So we've now seen a fossil sequence that goes from Homo erectus to Homo sapiens in eastern Africa. When do we find the first Homo sapiens elsewhere in the world? I mentioned before that some geographic regions are more amenable to preserving fossils. Also, in some regions of the world, the sediments in which we find fossils are a whole lot easier to date. Eastern African sites, for example, are straightforward to date, using argon-argon. Sites in southern Africa and elsewhere, they tend to rely on more experimental approaches, and so the dates have larger error bars around them. Carbon dating, which you've probably heard of, well, it's only useful this side of 30,000 years ago. So anything older than 30,000 years, it's too old for that dating technique. Therefore, the oldest fossil evidence of Homo sapiens in most regions of the world is a lot harder to pinpoint than it is in eastern Africa. But here's what we have. Ethiopia. So I showed you the skulls of Homo sapiens at 160,000 years ago. There are some specimens that are older, dating to about 200,000. South Africa, 100,000 years ago. Israel, 100,000 years ago. Australia, 60,000. Asia, 35,000. Europe, 40,000. The asterisks by Asia and European dates indicate that these are particularly controversial. But what all of this shows you is that the evolutionary history from Homo erectus to Homo sapiens is a worldwide story, and one that played out differently in different regions of the world. Let's hone in on the Middle East for a closer look. Specifically, let's go to this region called the Levant, where you find Israel and Jordan today. There are a series of cave sites that have been occupied by people for a very long time. I'll introduce you to 2 of them. The first is Qafzeh Cave, in what is now Israel. It dates to about 95,000 years ago, and there's a person standing at the cave opening, just kind of there in the middle toward the bottom, to give you a sense of scale. In this cave, the remains of Homo sapiens have been recovered. These are the earliest remains of Homo sapiens found in Eurasia, outside of Africa, 100,000 years ago. hold this in your mind. And now, we'll cross the valley to Kebara Cave. There was a burial in this cave too, and it is more recent, 60,000 years ago. A little younger than the burials in Qafzeh Cave, but the bones that were buried there are not of Homo sapiens. No, these are the remains of a Neanderthal. What? There were Neanderthals in this region of the world? Yes, there were. And they showed up after the Homo sapiens were there. Did they interact? Did they like each other? Did they fight? Did they make babies? This has been a matter of intense debate for a really long time. Paleoanthropologists, the people who study the bones of hominids, have had 3 hypotheses for the relationship between Homo erectus, Neanderthals, and Homo sapiens. Here are the agreed-upon facts. Homo erectus had that wide geographic range about 1 million years ago. By about 100,000 to about 40,000 years ago, by about 100,000 to about 40,000 years ago, the remains of people that look like Homo sapiens were in all of those places here. The people who look like Homo erectus, we all agree that they were gone. Let me introduce you to the hypotheses. Hypothesis 1. The candelabra model. This is the oldest model, and it was first proposed in the 1960s. The idea here is that Homo erectus migrated into the major geographic regions of Africa, Europe, Asia, and Eastern Europe, and once there, stayed. There was no interaction with Homo erectus elsewhere, and independently, each of these populations of Homo erectus evolved into Homo sapiens. The differences in the rate of the evolution from erectus to sapiens explains the differences between the populations found in these major continental regions. Today, Neanderthals represented an intermediate along the European lineage. I can feel you furrowing your brow, and you are right. There is something not quite right about this hypothesis. Scientifically, there is a major problem with this model. I accidentally had the notes up, so you already saw that. But scientifically, there is a major problem with this model. It is 100% evolutionarily unrealistic. So for this to have worked, each of the 4 populations of erectus had to independently evolve in the same way, which requires there to have been directionality in evolution. Well, there isn't directionality in evolution. To make this case, you would have to evoke a Lamarckian view of evolution. So it didn't take too long for the candelabra model to be rejected. Given the major issues with candelabra, it was revised and updated into what is now called the multi-regionalism model. This idea was first proposed in the 1980s, and it still has a strong influence today. In this revised model, Homo erectus expands across geography and evolves into Homo sapiens. However, contrary to the original candelabra model, this doesn't happen in isolation in each of those places. Rather, there is a little bit of migration between the different populations. And not a lot, just enough so that they didn't separate from each other into different evolutionary or onto different evolutionary trajectories. And I've indicated that on this figure by these little dotted arrows back and forth. So this model is more consistent with the evolutionary process. But one thing it implies is that the geographic differences we see across the continents stem from the early diversification of Homo erectus. The multi-regionalism hypothesis, or model, supposes that those differences we see today are very old and have their roots within Homo erectus. A more recent model is called the replacement or out of Africa model. Okay, first off, I have to point out that the name I find a little misleading. It kind of sounds like people packed up their bags and left Africa. Nobody ever actually left Africa. people living in Africa. What actually happened was that there was an expansion, an expansion of people moving into new territories that went beyond Africa. Okay, so in the replacement model, Homo erectus expands beyond Africa. There's a diaspora, and this gave rise to Neanderthals in Europe. But those populations, eventually they go extinct, except for the population in Africa. That population in Africa evolved into Homo sapiens. And that Homo sapiens then had a diasporic event into all of these other regions where they replaced Homo erectus. Now, there was lots of debate with the fossils. This is a hard one to address using fossils archaeology. But then everything changed for the science. In the 1980s, biologists figured out how to sequence fragments of DNA. And then there was an independent line of evidence that could be used to test these. Our understanding of the evolutionary origins of Homo sapiens entered a whole new phase of understanding. Before we venture into that dataset, we need to step back and learn a bit about genetics. So wrap up this module, and I'll see you in Module 4.